It's hard to imagine a piece of technology which has accelerated into our lives, quite like the mobile phone.
All these years later, I'm still asking the same questions. Are cell phones safe? And are we being told enough to make that decision for ourselves? Why are we being told to keep our phones away from our body?
There has been some concern for a while that radio frequency waves could affect cells in the brain, especially if your skull is thin, for example, if you're a child. So if I can just show you a quick animation, I think we'll bring the science really clear. Most people think their cell phones just receive waves, but they don't. The cell phone has to send a wave out in order to find a cell tower near you. That is an important clue for us about simple things we might be able to do to prevent any changes if, in fact, they're occurring. And notice again, the waves go into your brain. They have to. That's how the device works.
There's no way to say that cell phone use is safe. I think that the public has a right to know that there could be a potential risk. The public generally assumes that if one is selling something on the market, that we have had assurances that that device is safe.
To be clear, Dr. Black's message is at odds with headlines from the largest international study on cell phones and cancer. Their conclusion, little or no evidence cell phones are associated with brain tumors. But if you look just one layer deeper into the appendix of that same study, and you'll see something unsettling. Turns out participants in the study who used a cell phone for 10 years or more had doubled the rate of brain glioma, a type of tumor. And keep in mind, cell phone use in the United States has only been popular for around 15 years. Back in 1996, there were 34 million cell phone users. Today, nearly 300 million in use, according to industry figures.
Environmental factors take decades to see their effect, not a few years.
So if it may take decades to get a clearer answer, what can we say about cell phone safety now?
In children, their skull is thinner, their scalp is thinner, so the microwave radiation can penetrate deeper into the brain of children and young adults. And their cells are dividing at a much faster rate, so the impact of the microwave radiation can be much larger.
But there have been no studies on children in cell phone safety.
The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, they set the guidelines for how much radiation a cell phone can emit, and they say cell phones are safe. But how can they be so sure? Keeping them honest, we decided to come here to try and find out for ourselves, but they declined an on-camera interview.
The type of radiation coming out of your cell phone is called non-ionizing. It's not like an X-ray, but more like a very low-powered microwave oven.
What microwave radiation does, in the most simplistic term, is very similar to what happens to your food when you put your food in a microwave oven. It's essentially cooking the brain.
But based on their past statements, the FCC isn't convinced there's a real risk and maintain they, quote, do not endorse the need for consumers to take any precautions to reduce exposure.
There's been a lot of studies on this. The most recent study on cell phones is by researchers at the National Institutes of Health. Now, they found something very interesting, that the radiation emitted from your cell phone increased brain cell activity after about 50 minutes of talk time. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. These are natural scans of the brains looking at what is known as glucose metabolism, brain activity. It's one way of measuring it. This is with the cell phone on. Look how much yellow is in this area around the brain. Compare it to when the cell phone is off. Very little yellow, comparatively speaking. This is one of the first studies to actually show that there is an impact from using cell phones actually on the brain.
Why did you get interested in cell phones?
Because I knew about the history of tobacco and asbestos, because I'd worked on those things for 20 years.
Just because there's other issues that subsequently became problematic doesn't mean everything is going to become problematic.
Of course not, but in this particular case, I also knew enough about non-ionizing radiation to recognize that there were biological effects that hadn't been fully appreciated. And when I went back and I looked at the history of science, which is something I know a little bit about, I learned that the Navy had had warnings and had developed ways to protect personnel against some of these exposures, and I became curious.
As you talk about, and a lot of people do, everybody has one nowadays, and young kids are using them.
Well, I prefer to think that we were naive, and the reason you and I are talking is that we're no longer so naive about this issue. I think that there's a recognition also that the governments of France and Finland and Israel have issued warnings, and those are not countries known to take these issues lightly. I am particularly concerned as a grandmother about the developing brain, about children who are using cell phones, about toddlers and infants whose parents are downloading white noise apps and lullabies and putting the phones under their babies' heads or giving the babies phones to use as teething devices. We are so naive about technology.
A lot of people listening to this will say, look, I thought this was studied, and if there was something bad here, we would already know about it.
From studies of the Hiroshima bombing, we know that brain cancer did not show up at all as increased until 40 years after that bombing occurred.
When you put it like that, it seems to make sense that we certainly just don't know. Enough time has not passed to be able to say anything definitive on this.
The cell phone industry has been very, very powerful and is very influential on both sides of the aisle. For cell phone radiation, young people today are growing up in a sea of radio frequency radiation that did not exist even 5 years ago.
You're saying this new radiation has changed the amount that we're exposed to?
By billions and billions and billions of times. The amount of radio frequency radiation today is billions of times greater than occurred at the Big Bang through which we evolved human life. Recognize that microwaves play a very important role in many aspects of modern life. But I think direct microwave radiation of the brain, and that's why all the fine print warnings advise don't hold the phone directly on the body. And in fact, the test system for testing phones today, which gives you the specific absorption rate, uses a spacer here. For every millimeter away from the brain, you get a 15% reduction in radiation to the body.
We want to see what happens, what results they get when they test the phone the way people actually use them, right up against the body. So the chief engineer at this lab, his name is Jay Moulton, and he's going to do the test for us today. So we've got 3 phones here for testing. Okay. From the top 3 manufacturers. And the big sellers are the Samsung Galaxy, the LG 5, and the iPhone 7.
At this point, I'm going to adjust to set it so that the speaker is right at the edge of the ear.
That plastic ear is 6 millimeters thick and positions the phone at the distance it's assumed we hold it. And if you're thinking that head looks big, it's because it is.
The head was designed based on a 1950s Army study of all the Army men, and they came up with an average-sized head.
This idea was devised before little kids started using phones.
Yes.
This one-size-fits-all model is just one of the reasons critics say it's time for the testing to change.
Whether or not there was any effect on health from low levels of radiation like those from cell phones. The scientists running the study thought it would find nothing. They were astonished when they showed this increase in highly malignant, aggressive tumors of the brain and the heart.
What is interesting here, Anderson, if you dig a little bit deeper into this, what you find is that there is a certain amount of radiation that is considered the FCC limit. But that limit is sort of dictated by having the phone about an inch away from your head. If you move it closer to your head, they say they can no longer guarantee that your phone isn't emitting more radiation than the FCC limit, which is just stunning to me. So all those limits are only based on literally, having your phone a certain distance away from your head.
And I mean, I've been walking down the street watching people using their cell phones now. I have not seen one single person have it away. I mean, like everybody else, I mean, they're using it like I used it, which is like press as hard as you possibly can against your ear.
And here's the particularly bad thing about that. People pushing it really hard against their ear, in part because you may not have a good signal, you can't hear as well. That's, in fact, what we learned, the worst time to be doing that, and here's why. Your phone is not always giving off the same amount of radiation. If you have a poor signal, if you're having a hard time hearing the person, in fact, your phone is trying to compensate for that. Your phone is doing, trying to give you a better signal, and in the process of doing that, it is emitting even perhaps more radiation. This is a constant process. It's constantly communicating with cell towers. Further away from a cell tower, the sort of remote region that you're in, it could actually be exceeding, again, those FCC limits as far as radiation goes, trying to give you a better signal. But even the wired earpiece, which I carry, as you know, everywhere, it does have some, for example, wiring that may transmit some radiation up to the ear as well. So it's greatly reduced versus a cell phone, certainly much reduced versus holding it to your ear, but there is some as well.
What about like Bluetooth headsets?
Bluetooth is also going to be much less radiation than you're holding your phone to your ear. but it's not nothing. It's still a certain amount of non-ionizing radiation. The concern here, and again, this is from talking to lots of safety experts, is if as you're walking down the street, Anderson, you see people with this in their ear, they often leave it in their ear all day long.
Right.
Cab drivers, people who are on the move all day long. So they're essentially leaving that source next to their head the whole time. It's tough to say at a low dose what that's going to do, but it's the duration, and in this case, years of doing that is potentially the problem.
Joining me now is Dr. Deborah Davis, president of the Environmental Health Trust and author of the book Disconnect: The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation and Your Health, What the Industry Has Done to Hide It, and What You Can Do to Protect Your Family. Dr. Davis, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you with us. So what is the truth about cell phones?
The truth is they're very valuable devices, and they are two-way microwave radios that should not be held directly next to the brain or body. A cell phone is a very weak form of microwave radiation. Now, it's not as powerful as an oven, but it has a very similar frequency, and we are, some of us, using it for thousands of minutes a month right next to our brain. And I'm particularly concerned about how we're giving it to infants and toddlers. What we know now is that people who use cell phones heavily for 10 years or more have doubled or greater the risk of brain cancer in most well-controlled studies. Now, in fact, cancer is not the main concern that I have. I'm really concerned about sperm count and about effects on pregnancy. I just got back from a conference in Turkey and Greece where we heard new studies showing that prenatal exposure to animals results in offspring that have smaller brains and more hyperactivity. The World Health Organization reviewed the evidence on this with experts who were independent, and they concluded that cell phone radiation was in the same category as DDT and engine exhaust. Now, we take steps for DDT and engine exhaust. We won't give those things to children to play with. And we've got to start looking at the effects that we see on learning, on the nervous system, on some people who are very sensitive to this radiation and find it really incapacitating for long. A lot of people now are experiencing tinnitus, headaches, and even spells of dizziness that they can't fully understand. And it may turn out that these exposures are having effects on the nervous system that we don't really well understand.
A thimble full of research is what we have now.
The city is in a new battle over what it can say about cell phones and your cancer risk.
Berkeley's got the message out, but those signs have stirred up a lot of controversy.
For now, this law is in effect.
The cell phone industry wants them to come down.
Face-off today between two very high-profile attorneys over the issue of cell phone radiation warnings.
On the cell phone industry side, the same lawyer who fought for big tobacco.
There are no link between cell phones and any known health problems.
They're arguing that the signs are alarmist.
The total effect, Your Honor, is watch out.
But Berkeley is standing their ground.
All we've done is to make sure that consumers are aware of this basis.
The fight is expected to go all the way to the Supreme Court.
We will let you know when he issues his ruling.
When did you start to think this has something to do with a cellular phone?
I think when I saw the first MRI and saw the location of the tumor.
The message in my phone says, to reduce exposure to RF energy, use a hands-free option, such as speakerphone, to carry the phone at least 5 millimeters away from your body to ensure exposure levels remain at or below the as-tested levels.
Sanjay, your report is, I've already started using an earpiece. I've completely changed the way I've used my cell phone. I try not to carry it in my pocket. But I think the thing that surprised me most and really kind of caught my attention the most, which I hadn't realized, is that the manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
Yeah, that was pretty surprising to us as well. We came upon that particular fact a little bit into the investigation.
At the heart of the message the cell phone industry doesn't want displayed, information on how to make sure you're not exposed to radiation levels above the government safety limit. Whether it suggests carrying the phone at 5, 10, or 15 millimeters away from the body depends on how it was tested.
Today, 4 billion of us own one. And the average age of a child when they receive their first phone is just 8 years old.
By the time they're 19 or 20 years old, they will have used the phone for 10 years, and we have no idea what type of risk that's carrying.
You would hope that by now, a strict governing body would have been installed. An iron-fisted regulator who ensures the telecoms industry errs on the side of caution. someone to set strict levels which protect the public, someone to ensure that what we're being exposed to is absolutely safe. Unfortunately, we don't have any of that. What we do have is ICNIRP.
It stands for the International Committee of Non-Ionising Radiation Protection, and their job is to look at all the literature that comes out and basically summarise it.
You can't get elected to it, you get invited to join it,
right,
if you're one of the preferred people.
Right, got
so
you.
It's always erred on the side of industry because that's really where its roots are. None of the current rules are anything to do with chronic health effects or cancer. None of them, not one of them. They're all set for heating effects and acute effects like prickling of the skin or your eyebrows going up or something like that, you know. None of them are for long-term health effects.
So saying that it's below 40, that means nothing. It's meaningless.
It's meaningless. It is not intended to protect from long-term health effects.
ICNIRP is, well, ICNIRP is just irrelevant. It's irrelevant.
If you generate enough energy and localise it in a small enough area, you heat things. You heat tissue, you heat anything that has some level of water in it. The advisory body effectively are not set up to look at the evidence with regards to safeguarding the general public.
How much has our environment changed because of electromagnetic fields?
Over the last 25 years, it's changed beyond recognition. Just beyond recognition. It's millions and millions of times in terms of electromagnetic energy.
The former National Radiological Protection Board, in one of their documents, said that they thought that the radiation environment, if you like to call it that, had increased many millions of times from what it was 50 years ago. Many millions of times.
It's an enormous change in environment on Earth, and it completely swamps all these natural signals, including the Schumann waves that we have evolved with.
Generally speaking, the electromagnetic fields that they'll be reacting to is wireless. So it'll be wireless communications, it'll be Wi-Fi, it'll be cordless phones, deck phones, mobile phones, masts. All of them emitting signals that our body has never experienced before.
Most people's complaints are things like cardiac arrhythmia, insomnia, headache, visual disturbance, vertigo, different kinds of paresthesias or neurasthesias where they are feeling unusual sensations within their body. But really it can also affect endocrine function, thyroid function. Again, the list is really endless. I think that the symptoms are so diverse and the associations that people make are very difficult to accept if you have no knowledge of this subject, which most physicians do not have. And that's no fault of their own. We're not trained to recognise this condition. It's very innovative, and our understanding of it is entirely embryonic at this stage. We're at the very first steps of unravelling and fully understanding this condition. If we're looking at an organism to determine the presence of life, we're really looking for the presence of electricity. So with the electrocardiogram, for example, the ECG, and the electroencephalogram, the EEG, what we're looking at there is the presence of electricity from those target organs, the brain and the heart. And when we see the presence of that, that's a sign that there's life. So in a way, given that on a cellular level, electromagnetic fields are part of life itself, we could say that all life is electromagnetically sensitive. Is this a real condition? Yes, absolutely it is. At present, the World Health Organization statements regarding this are that it is real and symptoms can be severe and disabling. Figures for electromagnetic hypersensitivity are around 2 to 3%. Those are people who've had their life extremely affected by this condition. But, as I've previously mentioned, on a cellular level, 100% of people are reacting. That means that the healthcare consequences of not taking this seriously and not recognising it are potentially huge. And the numbers of people that have mild or moderate electrical sensitivity are probably far higher than we estimate.
With the advent of the mobile phone in the 1980s, came the need to build a network of antennas to support them. Since then, the telecom companies have erected over 5 million mobile phone masts around the world. But incredibly, prior to filling the air with microwave frequencies, they didn't conduct a single piece of research to ensure there wouldn't be any long-term health effects from such exposure. The grid was built without first making sure it was safe. Dr. Valco and her team studied 47 healthy people for an entire year. Participants had a cell phone placed on their left and right ears. One was activated but muted, the other was turned off. Dr. Valco used brain imaging equipment to study how much glucose the brain would use during exposure.
So it's a very sensitive marker to indicate if there are changes in brain activity that may be driven by a given stimulus, which in this case was the cell phone.
When the brain is stimulated, it consumes glucose in the same way a car consumes fuel.
50-minute exposure to a cell phone was associated with increases in glucose consumption by the brain, which indicates that the brain was being activated by the radio frequencies from the cell phone. This right area of the brain that was very close to the antenna showed the largest increases in metabolism as compared when the telephones were off. Even though the radio frequencies that are emitted from current cell phone technologies are very weak, they are able to activate the human brain to have an effect.
By using a muted cell phone, Dr. Valco's experiments showed that the human brain has a metabolic reaction to the presence of microwaves from a mobile phone. A metabolic reaction at levels well below the legal limit. Something many people claimed was impossible. Every millimetre of skull helps protect the brain against the phone's microwave radiation, and therefore lowers the phone's SAR rating. Children get their first phone at the average age of 8 years old. An 8-year-old skull is considerably thinner than that of an adult, so you would hope that phones are tested against a skull which represents the thickness of that of a child.
The SAM head is an average shaped and sized human skull. The average of 10,000 people has been taken in terms of their head measurements, and this SAM phantom head has been created, which is an average human skull.
Obviously, the head of an average human being is considerably larger than that of an 8-year-old child. But when we investigate the company that makes the SAM phantom head, we discover that the news is even worse. The SAM phantom isn't just the average of 10,000 people. It's the average of 10,000 US Army personnel. And US Army personnel most certainly have a larger, bigger, thicker head than the average 8-year-old. It's pretty reasonable to assume that if most mobile phones were tested against the skull of an 8-year-old, they would fail.
Who is it that sets the standards?
A group of people from a committee called ICNIRP.
The people who do the work on mobile phones are, by and large, engineers. They have no idea what is going on inside a living cell, but they are pontificating on this. They make the assumption that the only thing that can affect the well-being of a living organism is if it is powerful enough to heat the tissue. But that's like saying, we know if we boil an egg, it goes hard. What they don't know is that if they don't boil the egg, it turns into a chicken. And they haven't the slightest idea how that happens, but yet they pontificate as if they do.
You see here, this slide showing you the brain of an adult.
So this is where the cell
That is
phone would
correct.
sit, and this is the radiation that's absorbed?
Yes. This is the one we're most concerned about. This is the head of a 5-year-old.
Why the concern?
It's constantly emitting microwave radiation, and that radiation, if it's right next to your body, gets into you, whether it's your breast or your pants pocket. The reality is, every millimeter closer to the head or body you keep a phone, you can get more radiation.
In 2011, the World Health Organization changed the danger rating of mobile phones, reclassing it as possibly carcinogenic to humans, based on an increased risk of contracting a glioma, the type of brain tumor associated with using a mobile phone. Leonard Hardell. He has overseen the largest and most comprehensive piece of research ever conducted, combining his own work with that of others from around the world. From the early 1990s, they have investigated the phone habits of more than 2,000 people from around the world. People with tumours such as astrocytoma and acoustic neuroma, the brain tumours associated most with mobile phone use due to their proximity to the ear. Their findings are shocking. They concluded that mobile phone use does increase the risk of a brain tumour. And they also discovered why earlier research showed no effect.
This is one of the worst tumors we'd ever seen in a guy who said he lived on his phone.
In Edmonton, neuro-oncologist Dr. Jay Esau recently helped launch a brain tumor registry.
So as the tumor's growing, it's putting pressure on the skull
to track what we're seeing in Canada. So you're looking for answers.
100%.
What are your suspicions?
I believe that we're going to see more and more studies that show a correlation between cell phone use and the incidence of brain tumors. There's no question that we are seeing more young people coming into clinic with brain tumors. And the question is why. It's important to get the message out now. We need to at least get young people and adults to start thinking about their use and doing things that potentially can help protect them.
I think there's more evidence that it's carcinogenic than just possibly carcinogenic. But I can understand it in a way because most of the cancers which will arrive haven't arrived yet. I mean, people haven't been using cell phones for long enough for the true effect to become apparent.
At the back of almost every single phone's user guide are instructions on how far to keep your phone from your body. Instructions which, in the most part, are wholly unworkable. And what happens when the telecoms industry funds research into the harm that they are causing? And that research concludes that there is an effect. That the use of a mobile phone does play a role in the development of cancer. They tend to keep that research to themselves. Each day, our body loses about 500 million cells. And at night, that's when our body replaces those cells, through a process called cell mitosis, the dividing of cells.
And what it's doing is it's mopping up what are called free radicals. These free radicals are really the spare electrons left over from the process of making the energy which we need to repair ourselves in the first place.
Each night, as our body repairs itself, millions of free radical cells are created as a byproduct of cell mitosis. These free radical cells attack healthy cells. It is universally agreed that the free radical cell is the main causal factor in most cancer. Our body's main defense against these free radicals is its most powerful antioxidant, melatonin.
It passes into the bloodstream And its job is to act as a natural antioxidant, a natural anti-cancer agent. Melatonin is a very, very powerful anti-cancer agent.
What it does is it acts as what's called an oncostatic agent, that is, it protects you against cancer. It controls the sleep-wake cycle so that you get a good night's sleep when you've got proper melatonin. It's an anti-aging molecule. In other words, by mopping up those free radicals, it leaves your skin and complexion looking younger.
What are the consequences of having a reduced amount of melatonin?
Yeah. Well, you have a reduced amount of melatonin. What happens then is that your immune system starts to be less competent for a start. You tend to get sleep disturbance. You can't get off to sleep, or if you do, you wake up and can't get back to sleep. You can have heart complications because melatonin protects your heart as well. And you're much more prone to disease because your immune system is not functioning at its best. So these are some of the things that happen when you have a lowered melatonin level. And for example, the average woman with breast cancer has only got 1/10 of the melatonin of a normal woman of her age. And for people with prostate cancer, they've got less than half the melatonin that they should have. Autistic children have less than half the melatonin levels that they should enjoy.
Reduced melatonin in night shift workers, because they're working at night and exposed to light, they don't produce nocturnal melatonin, is known to produce a 50% increase in breast cancer risk. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, has actually classed night shift work as a class 2A probable carcinogen because of this melatonin reduction.
There are lots of studies now showing that people on night shifts or people who are blind have different cancer rates than the average population. And most of those studies support the view that the absence or the lowered melatonin has an adverse effect on health.
What kind of research has shown that there's an effect on melatonin production from electric fields, magnetic fields, radio waves?
Right, well, the Battelle Institute in America has done a lot of work on this way back from the late 1970s, in fact. And their scientists there, Barry Wilson and Dick Stevens and people like that, started thinking that because we know that if you turn the light on, then the brain stops making melatonin, they thought, well, maybe our brains can't distinguish between electric fields and that we make ourselves artificially, and the natural light that we all know happens during the daytime.
So the brain interprets radio waves as being light waves?
Yeah, we don't know the difference.
The hypothesis that the pineal gland cannot distinguish between light frequencies and man-made frequencies is certainly backed up by a wealth of research. Do you think it's pretty conclusive that electric fields, magnetic fields, radio waves affect the production of melatonin?
This research, which shows that kestrel melatonin levels fall with exposure, that white storks nesting on buildings near to radio masts have lowered progeny compared with stork nests a long way away from radio masts, studies on ants, studies on bees, and studies on birds of various kinds, studies on marine mammals, all point in the same direction.
But then there are studies in the laboratory of cells in the pineal gland which actually synthesizes the melatonin, and looking at the effects of magnetic fields on those cells. And at virtually every stage in the synthesis of melatonin, it's been shown that magnetic fields disturbs the actual production of melatonin. So you see, the evidence is in all aspects of the pathway of melatonin production, that the inhibition of melatonin production by magnetic fields, the research covers really every aspect of that pathway.
And the consequences of our bodies not producing the right amount of melatonin could be disastrous. Scientists around the world now believe that free radicals could be the causal factor in every known disease, not just cancer.
In the beginning of the 1900s, childhood leukemia was a medical rarity. We've seen nothing but an increase in childhood leukemia ever since that point. It's going up every year by about 2%. And that applies to many other disorders as well. Autism, brain tumours, cancer. Cancer rates in the 1910s were probably half of what they are today. And many other diseases are being connected by studies, by scientific studies, with exposure to electromagnetic fields and radiations. Not just power lines, but also to radio fields and microwave fields. Because we've in the last 50 years, really, we've immersed ourselves in an ocean of electromagnetic radiation. It's all around us now. Invisible, we can't see it, but we know it's there. Every time you lift up your mobile phone, you know it's there.
It's very, very hard to turn the clock back, or if not impossible to turn the clock back. But we need to be aware of the adverse health effects so that we have the choice of taking precaution against the exposures. If that's what we wish to do, that's what we need to do.
What worries me are things that are actually happening now. Right. That we haven't paid enough attention to, perhaps. And one of the things that's happening is autism, or to give it its proper name, autistic spectrum disorder.
We are losing this population of people who are not exposed. Even the few people who don't own a mobile phone are surrounded by the radiation from the mobile phone when they go shopping, when they go on a train, wherever they go.
It's not just the canary down the mine like myself. Eventually, if you simply increase the electromagnetic fields in the atmosphere, which we're doing, and we're now got a million times more electromagnetic fields, microwaves in the environment than we had 30 years ago, eventually it'll start to affect you.
It's very, very hard to say where we might be in 15 years' time, but I would very much hope within a few years' time we do recognise just how much these ill health effects are actually costing society. And then we might wake up and look at the causes and realise we have to do something about the causes.
When was the last time you saw somebody with a phone there who wasn't under age 70?
Why don't they test the way that people use it, like next to the body?
I think if phones were tested the way people use them, none of them would pass.
Time to start our test the way most of us carry them.
We'll roll this thing all the way up until it touches and has a 0 gap.
Have you ever done that test for anyone else before?
No, I haven't, because it's not a requirement, so the manufacturers don't do it very often.
But what harm could that do?
We have known now for more than 10 years that men who keep phones in their pocket have lowered sperm count, they have poorer sperm quality.
Young women sometimes wear their phones in their bra.
Correct. This is an MRI that was shared with us by our colleague, Dr. John West, of a 21-year-old. These are tumors in her breast, the hot spot right here, right under where the phone was kept.
But how do you know that could be caused by a cell phone?
We don't know, but what we know is this. It's extraordinarily unusual for a young woman to have one breast cancer. To have 2 3 or 4, and they all develop as separate tumors under the antenna of the phone, that's beyond coincidence.
So the tests are all done.
Tests are all finished.
And?
The number exceeded the limit. It went up significantly with each one of the phones.
That's right. The phones exceeded the safety limit when they were moved right against the body. The radiation absorbed increased 3 to 4 times.
Keep it 15 millimeters away from your body.
Canadian groups have been urging Health Canada to reassess those safety limits too, since science now shows possible harm below the level that phones are tested for.
We're stuck in this quagmire of believing this science that's decades old.
Frank Clegg's the former president of Microsoft Canada. Now he heads a group advocating for safer use of technology.
There are dozens and dozens of studies that we presented to Health Canada that show harm at levels below Canada's guidelines.
He thought they were making headway when a couple of years ago the government agreed to review the issue. Over 200 studies were submitted by Clegg's group, research on humans and animals, suggesting potential harm, everything from behavior changes to DNA damage and sperm abnormalities, all at radiation levels below what phones are tested for. Clegg was told many don't meet Health Canada's bar. He wants to know why.
I think they're looking for any excuse they can find to continue with the status quo.
4G technology is being rolled out around the world. To accommodate this, the ceiling levels are being increased. Wi-Fi is in almost every single home, school and business, surrounding us constantly. Deck phone technology is the norm in almost every single household. At a time when the industries responsible should be displaying caution, they are displaying a reckless disregard for our long-term health. Money talks. And they are about as likely to develop a conscience as the tobacco industries did. If there's going to be a change, it's not going to come from them. It's going to have to come from us. We just need to open our eyes and see the problem.
City of San Francisco pushed for radiation warning labels on cell phones. The head of a prominent cancer research institute sent a memo to all employees urging them to limit cell phone use because of possible risk of cancer. And the European Environmental Agency has pushed for more studies, saying cell phones could be as big a public health risk as smoking, asbestos, and leaded gasoline.
What is the worst case scenario? If you extrapolate the numbers that you've just talked about, how bad could this be?
It could be a global epidemic. People do have a right to know there are simple things to do. We've got to have more of a public conversation about this. And we are poorly served by reassurances that everything is okay, by misuse of science. It's not helping us, it's not helping our children.